There's nothing like summertime here in the North Carolina Triad. And when it comes to the season's can't-miss events, at the top of the list is the Coal Pit Live Music Series at Incendiary Brewing in downtown Winston-Salem. And this year, our wonderful partners at the Ginther Group are proud to sponsor it to help provide unforgettable fun all summer long. The 2025 schedule begins on May 31st and runs all the way through Incendiary's 7th anniversary party on September 13th. If you visit theginthergroup.com or follow them on Facebook and Instagram, you'll be able to see the details on every upcoming show, along with any special promotions. Again, a huge shout out to the Ginther Group Real Estate for sponsoring this year's Coal Pit Live series at Incendiary Brewing. And a great way to join us in helping to say thank you, just keep them in mind for all your real estate needs. It's one simple phone call, 336-283-8689, or just one simple click to theginthergroup.com.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.
I'm Algernon Cash, and you're locked in. North Carolina's political landscape is shifting. No budget, high-profile announcements, and major legislation with far-reaching consequences. Today, I'm joined by Joe Stewart, Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina. He is a true Raleigh political insider with decades of experience navigating the legislative process. We'll unpack what's happening behind the scenes at the General Assembly, the ripple effects of recent political announcements, and how it all could impact North Carolinians in the months ahead. Joe, thank you for locking in, man. How are you today?
Great to be with you today. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I received your email. You were fishing for speaking opportunities. I said, let me go ahead and about time to get you back on and perhaps give us an update on what's happening inside the Beltline over in Raleigh. I'm sure you've been active this year.
Yeah, it's been a busy year. And in addition to my responsibilities with the independent insurance agents, we cover quite a bit of the waterfront relative to property and casualty insurance related issues. I also, through a collaborative agreement, serve as the lobbyist for the state chapter of the National Association of Benefits and Insurance Professionals, the Health Insurance Agents Association. So in addition to traditional P&C types of insurance issues, have to monitor and weigh in on healthcare and health insurance related issues as well. So keeps me really busy.
Well, for my audience, I've known Joe for many, many years. He is a familiar voice and face here on the show, and always grateful when you make a little time to visit with us and just keep us updated on what's happening in Raleigh and right here in our backyard. It's so busy nowadays. I know all these hardworking folks who listen to my show find it challenging to keep up with everything that's happening day to day. But I guess, Joe, let's start with the elephant in the room. The legislature hasn't passed a budget this session. And so I know you're a political insider. What's the real story behind the stalemate?
You know, it's an interesting observation. Any enterprise needs to have a budget in place so that it can understand how it needs to deploy resources towards its strategic objectives. A government is not any different than business or even a family in that regard. A few years back, the legislature decided that when they could not come up with a budget plan immediately, the start of our state fiscal year is July 1st. So if the budget was not prepared in time for the start of the new fiscal year, simply the existing budget would continue on. So at the federal level, when there's not a federal budget produced, Congress has to authorize what's called a continuing resolution, in effect, to authorize the existing budget to continue on into the new fiscal year. But in North Carolina, that's not required. There's no vote required. It just happens automatically that the budget continues. So to some extent, while you might say that takes a little bit of the political nature of budget making out of the process, it does unfortunately take away the imperative that legislators historically have felt to want to try to get a budget in place by the time of the start of the new fiscal year, just if for no other reasons. It's good business practice, but also the appearances of the legislature having gotten its primary function of crafting a state tax and spending plan, having that in place in a timely fashion. So a couple of things here, Algernon, that probably were at play and to some extent. One of them is that the state's doing pretty well. We have a really healthy cash reserve, what's called our rainy day fund at some point. A significant portion, over $2 billion of that total has now been applied towards various needs associated with Hurricane Helene recovery. So, but that was about 7 billion and still has a relatively healthy balance, a little over 5 billion. Collections, state collections of revenues moving along pretty much as projected. So there's a long-winded way of saying there wasn't necessarily a strong, compelling reason for a budget to necessarily put in place. If the state had a lot more in collections than it had projected, or a lot less than it had projected, there would be need to take some action. But most conspicuously, what not having a budget takes away from the process is the ability of the legislature to increase the pay of public workers, teachers, and state employees, which is a significant part of the state's budget, and just in terms of the of how the dollars are spent. But it means that those public employees go without any pay raises or bonuses or whatever the legislatures come up with, and so that's kind of where we stand. Also, one of the factors is the longtime Speaker of the House, Representative Tim Moore, moved on to Congress. He now serves in as part of our congressional delegation. A brand new Speaker, Representative Destin Hall. So a new player in terms of the leadership on the House side, and sometimes the negotiation between the House and the Senate is impacted when there's a change in the lineup of the players, and that's probably a little bit of the function. State representative, when he was State Representative Tim Moore, and the President pro tem, the leader of the Senate, Phil Berger, had both been in those positions for over a decade, and so there was a lot of familiarity of how the negotiation between the House and the Senate versions of the budget would go, and maybe a little bit of newness to it as a result of there being a new speaker. And so I think those were contributing factors. Not a lot of other big substantive public policy issues, but some pretty significant difference of opinion about taxation issues between the House and the Senate. What we might say are fundamental principled differences of opinion in terms of how the tax decreases that Republicans approved a few years back would be implemented going forward. And so that was a significant sticking point between the House and the Senate, whether or not to accelerate those decreases in taxes, tax rates or not. And so all of those factors combined, my father once famously said, that people oftentimes say, "Ooh, I wish I had a silver bullet," when in fact, 6 lead ones would probably be good. Most problems are not one thing. It's a lot of little things, and that's probably what's resulted where we are. But the impasse came produced, I should say, a relatively abrupt end to the legislative session back in late June. And the General Assembly came back just recently to take up some overrides of gubernatorial vetoes and to pass what they call a mini budget, a few spending items, most notably to deal with the additional funding needed for enrollment increases in K-12 and the community college systems, but not much more than that. But some speculation that the House and the Senate, the negotiators on budgetary issues, are continuing to have conversations, and that it may be at some point, probably my guess would be after Labor Day, the General Assembly will have worked through most of these differences in the two versions of the budget, and we'll come back to Raleigh and enact something and send it off to Governor Stein for his signature or veto.
Thank you for that, Joe. That's a great recap. So I know that I saw the news around the mini budget, but it's sounding like from your commentary that maybe somewhere around Labor Day, they'll come back for a short session to be able to pass a full budget. You highlighted and mentioned some of the veto overrides. I know that I've been seeing all of the political posts on X and Instagram from the North Carolina House Republicans bragging about the veto overrides that they've put in place. From our audience that may not be watching this very closely, what was some of the substance behind some of those vetoes or veto overrides?
Yeah, the context of this is in the North Carolina General Assembly, there are 50 seats in the state Senate and 120 seats in the state House. To override a gubernatorial veto, the chamber has to produce 3/5 of the members present and voting to override the veto. And so on the Senate side, the number of seats occupied by Republican incumbents is 30. So it is 3/5, 30 of the 50. And so on a party line vote, the Senate can override a gubernatorial veto. In the House, they are 1 seat short. There are only 71 of the 120 seats held by Republicans. And so a veto override would necessitate a Democrat crossing over to override the veto of the Democratic Governor, Josh Stein. And so of the 14 bills that the legislature had passed that Governor Stein had vetoed, the Senate was able to take up all 14 and vote to override the veto, but the House and both chambers have to in effect, vote to override the veto. The House was able to cobble together a Democrat or two to vote along with the Republicans on the override on some of the issues. And it wasn't the same Democrats that went along with the Republicans on all of the 8 overrides that they were able to effect. And to some extent, there's two things to keep in mind about this. One, it is quite possible that a Democrat would have a vote of conscience, would feel very strongly about a particular subject matter. And in many of these instances, the original legislation, that Democrat had in fact voted to support the legislation. But voting as a member of one party or the other, voting against your governor is a relatively significant deal. And you may remember, your listeners may remember, a few years back, a state senator named Kirk Deviere from Cumberland County, Democrat, voted against then Governor Cooper on a veto override. And Governor Cooper very conspicuously announced his intentions to find another Democrat to run against Deviere in the Democratic primary, and did and beat Deviere in the primary. And so, as a Democrat, or of either party, but in this case, as a Democrat member of the House voting to override a Democratic governor's veto, there's a little bit of that sense of, well, this may ultimately prompt a primary challenge of those Democrats. And so, of the 4 Democrats that did cross over on these 8 bills, now the speculation is we'll have to wait and see if they've incurred a primary opponent. Sometimes it's not an organized effort that produces a primary opponent for someone that's done what they've done, in effect, voting against their party's governor. Sometimes just local Democrats or local Republicans get mad that their incumbent did that and so run against them. But those dynamics play out. And I'm not saying that this is a function of it, but in the instance of Senator Deviere, this was the case as a result of his willingness to support the override of a veto of his Democratic governor. He found he had much more leverage with the Republican leadership in the Senate, was able to do things within the context of the budget that were beneficial to his district, which is a part of the legislative process. Those projects that are eligible for state consideration, many times if you're in the minority party, and this has been true regardless of who was in charge, but you have a lot more of an opportunity to do good things for your district if you're in good standing with the majority. And so I would suspect at some level, the Democrats that voted to override Governor Stein's veto saw this as an opportunity to perhaps find a way to get something that was important for their district done by supporting the Republican position on these overrides. And so, again, a lot of different reasons for these things to having been done, but there will be some interesting times. The filing for candidacy opens up in December for the 2026 elections. And we'll see if those Democrats that chose to, in effect, support the Republican position on these veto votes, if they, in fact, incur a primary opponent.
There's a lot of, I don't know, a lot of friction and concern, I'll put it that way, that's coming out of Washington, D.C. with the current Trump administration. And when you look at a purple state like North Carolina, where Trump really won by pretty much a slim margin, and then you look down ballot, Republicans didn't fare quite as well in some of the state races. Republicans are barely holding on to the House in terms of a majority. What's the likelihood that some of what's happening out of Washington could have some backlash in this upcoming election cycle?
By historical standards, midterm elections in the United States have a tendency to go against the party in control of the White House. And that's been true whether or not the president was a Democrat or Republican. It's sort of just the natural pendulum effect of American politics. So heading into the 2026 election, the assumption is that perhaps Republicans will lose some seats in Congress and maybe not fare as well in other down ballot races as a result of this, what's generally referred to as a wave dynamic. And a wave meaning, of course, Alzadon, you can stand on the beach and a wave comes and it just slaps up against your ankles, or a wave comes and it completely overwhelms you. And so the size of a wave at a midterm election varies. And in some measure, we know that voters have a tendency to be focused on economic and financial issues. And so some part of how voters go into the 2026 election cycle will be shaped by their general attitude and impression of the economy and how their family is likely to fare in the near term, just in terms of the price of food and rent and inflationary pressures that they're feeling, whether or not they feel secure in their occupation. Those sorts of factors do have a tendency to play. And because the the one party or the other's in charge of the White House. Sometimes incumbents get blamed for the state of things in the country economically. Whether or not they deserve that blame is another podcast we can have a conversation about. But
Sure.
at this point, I would say there are a wide variety of opinions about what the likely attitude of voters will be in the 2026 election. But there's three things in North Carolina specifically to keep in mind. The first and foremost is all 170 of our legislators those races are on the ballot every 2 years. And so our entire General Assembly will be up for election or re-election next year. So that's a lot of races that take place. All of our congressional delegation, all 14 of those members that serve in the U.S. House will be on the ballot. And at this point, I think every incumbent is fully expected to run for re-election, so there won't be any open seat races. But between the state legislative and congressional districts, there are not many districts that are drawn to make them really competitive, meaning that in an examination of the historical voting patterns of people that live within those state legislative and congressional districts, their preference for one party's candidate or the other over time has been relatively consistent. So really only the first congressional district in northeastern North Carolina, Don Davis, a Democrat, is the incumbent there. But of the 170 state legislative races that will be on the ballot next year, probably maybe 6 or 7 or 8 of that total have that dynamic of being historically not a strong preference for Democrats or Republicans, is not leaning one way or the other necessarily. So not many of those races of the state legislature and Congress will be highly competitive, meaning candidates will not be raising a lot of money and spending a lot of money and getting voters excited and enthusiastic about turning out because of their party, wanting to support their party's candidates. So that will have some muting effect on the turnout. The second is the other big high-profile race, of course, is our U.S. Senate contest. Tom Tillis, the incumbent Republican, choosing not to run for re-election. The two candidates have emerged. Again, the filing doesn't open until December, but former Governor Roy Cooper, a Democrat, announced his intentions to run for the Senate. Michael Whatley, the former chair of the state Republican Party and National Republican Party, also announcing his intention to run in the Republican primary. So, in Whatley receiving the endorsement of President Trump, meaning virtually any other Republican that might have considered running in the primary for U.S. Senate probably won't, because of the powerfulness of having an incumbent president of your party say that you're their favorite candidate. So that having been said, it means the primary election in next March, there's not going to be a lot on the ballot that's going to excite voters or get them enthusiastic about turning out. And when there's a lower than usual turnout of voters, sometimes there can be an increased number of surprised outcomes in primary elections. Somebody that's challenging an incumbent with a really enthusiastic, while small, base of supporters can perhaps prevail just because so few voters are excited about turning out in that election. So it may be that the primary race produces some surprising upsets for us that we might not have otherwise expected, but we'll have to see what the issue sets are and what the dynamics for the primary and how that produces a slate of candidates for the two-party heading into the fall.
You know Dewey's Bakery for its iconic sweets and treats, the sugar cakes, the thin cookies, and the cake squares, especially on Mondays when you can get one of those delectable squares for free. But during these hot months, you can't forget about the ice cream. Made from scratch and featuring all your favorite flavors, Dewey's ice cream is the perfect way to beat the heat this summer. And what do we always tell you about Dewey's? It's the place for all of life's celebrations. And in the summer, that means weddings. Since 1930, Dewey's has been crafting delicious wedding cakes, plus custom cupcakes and groom's cakes. Team up with one of their celebration specialists to find the perfect fit for your special day. To get started, just email cake@deweys.com or swing by the Thruway location in Winston-Salem. And for any of your everyday cravings, you can also visit the store at Renolda Manor or at Friendly's Shopping Center in Greensboro. Dewey's, celebrate every day. It's time to get serious about your financial future. It's never too early, but it could be too late to get started. And that's oftentimes the hardest part, getting started. How much do I save? Where do I invest? Do I save for college or retirement? How much for each? And who do I talk to about it all? Okay, we'll keep things simple for now and help you answer the last one. We recommend you begin with a local financial advisor. And that's Jennifer Johnson of Three Magnolias Financial Advisors. She'll sit down with you for a complimentary introductory consultation and go over all of your questions. Get started on the path to achieving your financial goals. Visit 3magnoliasfinancialadvisors.com or call 336-701-1600. Get comfortable with your financial future. 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors. Retirement, financial planning, and investments. Securities offered through Private Client Services. Member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors. 3 Magnolias Financial Advisors and Private Client Services are not affiliated. Private Client Services is under separate ownership from any other named entity.
Yeah, Joe, I want to, you said a lot there, but I want to focus on the state races for a moment. So let's rewind a little bit. So it sounded like you're saying that out of the 170 districts that are in the legislature, that most of them aren't competitive, with a handful of just 6, which I think speaks to a significant, much larger problem, and a problem that voters really should be demanding some change around. You're not in a position where a lot of times you get an opportunity to pick the best candidate, because most of these races are already decided, and they get decided in the primary. There's no general election opponent, and if you can clear a primary and you can appeal to the partisan interest of your party, you some kind of way get a seat. At what point, Joe? I mean, just real quick here. At what point does that stop? Does voters finally stand up and say, okay, hey, we want an opportunity to vet the best candidate, and not just the candidate we get stuck with because of all these gerrymandered districts?
It is an interesting dilemma, and I've given this a lot of thought, and there are really 2 things to consider. One, Dr. Michael Bitzer is a political science professor from Catawba College and has studied and evaluated. If you look at all of the precincts in North Carolina, over 2,700 of these, it's really the geographic base unit of a voter is what precinct they vote in, and that's where they live. Of the 2,700 precincts, only a handful are competitive. And in some part, what's happening in America, what's happened over the last couple of decades, is people have chosen increasingly to live only among people they agree with ideologically and on a partisan basis. So people are segregating themselves on a political identity basis. And of course, because a congressional or state legislative district has to be contiguous, people have to all live within the same area. Some reflection of what we characterize as gerrymandering. Some of it is just the fact that it's very difficult to find geographically places in North Carolina where people are living among people they disagree with politically. So that's a part of it. Of course, the way that the maps are drawn too does take into account some greater technological sophistication in terms of identifying voters and putting together maps that are going to produce a particular outcome. And parties have done that historically in the United States. This is as old as our democracy is, for people in elective office that have the ability to inform and influence the configuration of a district to want it to produce a particular outcome. So that's not unusual. The other is the primary process may be the problem. We have, you think about it this way, the taxpayers of the state of North Carolina pay for the 2 main parties, and all political parties, quite frankly. We pay for their process of determining who their candidate is. We open up all of the precincts in the state. We pay for the distribution of ballots and the operation of the precincts, and all of that is paid for so that the party can have determined who it wants its candidate to be in the fall. We do that in part, philosophically, is just make sure people maintain some sense of the integrity of the electoral process. But there's nothing that requires, under our system of government, there's nothing that requires the government run the process for determining who the party's nominees are. And that's in effect what a primary is. Now, there's 2 things to keep in mind. One, we have had for several decades open primaries. So you're registered unaffiliated, meaning you've not chosen to designate your voter registration with one party or the other. You are entitled to vote in any of the party's primaries that you want to. You just have to pick one, and that's the primary that you vote in. And when that was made possible, interestingly enough, the Republican Party in the state was quick to allow unaffiliated voters to vote in their primary. The Democrats were a little more reticent about that. But that having been said, unaffiliated is now the plurality of registered voters and is on a trajectory to become the majority of registered voters in North Carolina. So clearly, something about the partisan designation in voting has shifted, but we've probably got to come up with a different system. And here there's an abundance of options, but so far my consideration of this, any one of those choices just presents a different set of problems. Doesn't necessarily solve this, but it makes me perhaps different. But if the way
Well,
that the state has shifted in terms of people where they live and their political disposition and who they choose to be their neighbor, and the primary process is really when the election takes place, because whomever wins the primary, given the way the district's configured, is very likely to win in the fall. We probably need to change the process for how candidates are
I
selected.
I think we need to look at a lot of changes up and down the entire process. You mentioned, in your original commentary, you mentioned a little bit about Senator Tillis, and obviously he's announced his retirement, and a lot of this happened over the big beautiful bill. I don't, I have an article in the Carolina Journal for my audience that, it was published last week. I would love for you to go back and read it. And I talk a little bit about, I don't think Tillis necessarily agreed with the pro-growth policies of the big beautiful bill. I think he really disagreed with the process. And I think he, along with a lot of other people, have just grown weary of the bullying that's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. I know that I've certainly grown weary of it. And I tell you, Joe, my head is scratching most days when I look at what congressional Republicans are allowing to happen, whether they agree with the policies or not. They've completely abdicated their authority. I believe that in this upcoming race with Roy Cooper for the U.S. Senate, I just got a feeling it's going to blow back on him. I really do. And people that follow me on Facebook and online, you know that I'm a registered Republican, but I've already said very clearly I'm supporting Roy Cooper. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think congressional Republicans need to have a timeout here, because they've just not responded to this administration with any sense of accountability. So I know the Daily Mail came out with a story, Joe, recently about Roy Cooper and something to do with his wife. I I don't care if they tell me that Roy Cooper came from the planet Krypton and he is smuggling, interplanetary weapons of mass destruction to Earth. I am voting for Roy Cooper simply because the Republicans have completely overplayed their hand. And I see even here at the state level, this leads into my question, even at the state level, I feel like we've gotten away from some of those just core pro growth policies that Republicans were known for about a decade or so when they took control of the legislature. We've moved away from that. And Senator Tillis was someone that was a champion of a lot of that when he was Speaker of the House. Now, for the last several years coming out of COVID, North Carolina has been voted one of the top states to do business in. I mean, do we run any risks, Joe, from breaking away from those pro growth policies that gave Republicans the legislature? For all of a sudden, you see this kind of attempt to align itself with what they see happening in Washington.
It's a very provocative question. And for 5 years, at 2001 and a little after 2005, I served as chief deputy state treasurer. And one of the things I learned going into that role in North Carolina, all of the debt issued by city and county governments, in addition to the state, any subdivision of the government, the debt flows through the treasurer's office. And so it's kept North Carolina's reputation, financial integrity reputation, very strong. We have very few defaults on municipally or publicly issued debt because it is all evaluated centrally by the state treasurer and monitored. Even the statute allows the treasurer can take over the operation of a city or county if the treasurer, in their opinion, thinks they're not doing the things necessary to manage the fiscal integrity to repay that debt. It's
Hmm.
served the state well. But when a bond is issued, municipal bonds are issued, there's a document attached to it called the official statement. And in effect, that's the explanation to potential bond buyers of why the state of North Carolina is a good investment. And it can be a relatively dense read. It's put together by bond lawyers that are in effect attorneys that as I came to learn working in the treasurer's office. Bond lawyers are lawyers that really like to read. And so it's really a dense document. But it's interesting. The first time I took it upon myself to read the official statement, it talks about what makes North Carolina a good investment. And I wish it was mandatory reading for everyone in elective office in North Carolina, because what it talks about is making sure that the state is effectively putting forward the resources to invest in North Carolina in a way that will continue its financial prosperity. And so some part of the conversation that's taking place currently the North Carolina we grew up in, it was the partisan disposition of the state was really a function of geography. And Republicans were in the western part of North Carolina and Democrats in eastern, but everybody more or less was a conservative and a fiscal conservative for sure.
Hmm.
So what's happened is that the nationalization of partisan disposition in the state, the state Republican and state Democratic parties are a far greater reflection of the national identity of those parties than they have been historically. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is the growth in North Carolina populationally has been people moving from other parts of the country. So people's sense of partisan identity has shifted from what it was historically, just because they're applying whatever their thought about partisan identity is from where they're from. But but for us to remain a really attractive place for businesses to come, for companies to be able to expand their workforce here in North Carolina, prosper in North Carolina, it requires the kinds of concentrated and thoughtful investment that the official statement that's attached to every debt instrument talks about. And that is not as much of the conversation anymore. And it's in part because of the way that we've become divided politically. Very small but vocal extremes within both parties now
Hmm.
seemingly have greater sway over the orientation of the two parties. And as a result, the vast majority of people who would consider themselves ideologically somewhere in the middle have fallen out from the decision-making process. And it's the more extreme elements of the two parties that have the greater role in these decisions. And so that makes it harder. Even it's a reflection of I say politics is a reflection of people. And the number of people that report the reason they're voting the way they're voting is so they can vote against the other party's candidate. They're not even consider the qualifications or abilities of their own party's candidate as much as they just want to vote against the other party. I mean, that's a tricky proposition. We need people in roles of leadership that are qualified and have vision and are willing to work with people they disagree with to come up with policy solutions. And unfortunately, that's just not a part of American politics today.
No, it's not. And I tell you, I find myself watching old clips of George Bush and Mitt Romney and John McCain. I mean, things that maybe they said at once that people thought were pretty radical, but they all look fairly benign in the current climate. Joe, I've got 1 minute here. I know you're full of knowledge, but try to give me a 1 minute reaction to this. You've been around and a long time, not trying to date you at all, but really just trying to give credit and compliment your knowledge and wisdom. I've been able to learn from you, and I know my audience has learned from you as well. Everything I see happening out of Washington, D.C. appears to be completely unorthodox. And I won't even get into naming a list because it shifts and changes almost day by day, depending on what I'm watching. And to be honest with you, I can't even keep up with everything. I don't think anyone can keep up with everything in this present climate. But based on your knowledge, your wisdom, your understanding of history, and everything you've seen politically, what is it that Americans should really be watching the next 6 to 12 months?
That is a great question to conclude on. I'd say there's two critical things. One, we have this tremendous federal debt. Over 120% of our gross domestic product is what we owe. And it is a considerable burden on this country and our ability to make investments appropriately. We've been downgraded by all of the rating agencies. And in part, what's more worrisome, I just saw this, of all of the central banks in all of the world, the amount of currency held on reserve up 10 or 15 years ago, 75% of all the currencies held was American dollars, and now it's less than 50%. So the confidence the world has in America being a stable nation with a good, prudent financial management plan is diminished. The second is we just need to see a shift, and I hope it's younger people. I don't necessarily hope it, but I think it's historically precedented. Younger people will come to a different way of thinking of part of politics and partisan identity and ideology, and maybe that'll level things out a little bit. They won't want it to be as acrimonious as they've observed it in the recent years, and so I'm hopeful that they get things back on track.
Politics shapes everything from the roads you drive on to the insurance rates you pay. Conversations like this help us cut through the noise and understand the forces shaping our state and our nation. If you value independent, thought-provoking discussions that keeps you informed and engaged, consider supporting our work. Make a donation to help us keep bringing these important conversations to life. And also make sure you stay locked in with WTOB, because every Sunday morning, that's where you can lock in with me. But if you happen to miss me there, you can always subscribe and download the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Pandora, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. You can always lock in there. And until next time, y'all stay locked in.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode on the Triad Podcast Network. Our mission is simple: provide information, advice, and stories about the people and places that make the North Carolina Triad such a great place to be. You can find us by searching Triad Podcast Network on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much wherever you like to listen. If you like what you heard and want to support the show and those that contribute, we would truly appreciate a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. It helps spread the word along, as do your shares on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Triad Podcast. To get in touch with us, simply email info@triadpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.